It's a golden evening along California's coast on February 23, 1942. At the Ellwood oil facility, worker G. Brown steps outside for a breath of fresh air. The ocean's peaceful tonight, but as light disappears behind the horizon, he notices something odd. A long, dark figure slowly rising from the Pacific waters. Brown squints, trying to figure out what he's looking at. But before he can identify the strange creature before him, the ground trembles beneath his feet. The car on Highway 101 slams its brakes as plumes of earth erupt near the shoreline. People pour into the streets, watching streaks of fire arc through the night sky. No one knows what's attacking them, but one thing is painfully clear. America's mainland is no longer safe. Predator of the Pacific. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, as Pearl Harbor burned and America's Pacific Fleet lay shattered, submarine I-17 prowled the waters north of Oahu. Her mission was brutally simple: sink any American warships attempting to escape the carnage. However, none emerged from the smoke and flame. When the attack ended, I-17 received new orders that would change the war's trajectory: redeploy east to American waters. Commander Kozo Nishino quickly complied, confident that he commanded no ordinary vessel. At nearly 109 meters long, I-17 was one of the largest submarines in the world, dwarfing American Gato-class boats by 18 meters and German U-boats by more than 30. Her diesel engines delivered 12,400 horsepower, nearly double the output of her American counterparts. She could reach 23.5 knots on the surface, making her one of the fastest submarines of the war. But I-17's true advantage lay in her incredible range. She could cruise 14,000 nautical miles at 16 knots without refueling, far beyond any American or German boat. Her 6 forward torpedo tubes carried 17 torpedoes, following Japanese doctrine that prioritized aggressive, head-on attacks. Her 14-centimeter deck gun fired 38 8-kilogram shells with devastating reach and explosive power. Most remarkably, I-17 carried a Yokosuka E-14Y reconnaissance floatplane, stored in a sealed hangar and launched via catapult, giving her over-the-horizon surveillance capability that no other submarine could match. By December 20th, 1941, I-17 had taken position off Cape Mendocino on the northern California coast. Through his periscope, Nishino spotted what he was hunting: the 6,912-ton tanker SS Emidio, sailing alone and defenseless from Seattle to San Pedro. She had no escorts, no air cover. She was just a fat target, wallowing helplessly in the shipping lanes. I-17 burst to the surface like a breaching whale. Her deck gun swiveled toward the unsuspecting tanker. 5 high-explosive rounds tore through the Emidio's steel plating, sending fragments screaming through the superstructure. The ship went silent in the water, her crew scrambling for lifeboats as their vessel drifted toward the jagged rocks near Crescent City. For the first time, a Japanese attack had come close to the American mainland, and it was only the beginning. Fear takes hold. The sinking of the Emidio sent shockwaves through Imperial Navy headquarters in Tokyo. They had tasted American merchant shipping off the coast, and the appetite for more was insatiable. Plans were immediately drawn for a Christmas Eve bombardment of coastal cities, a holiday gift of terror for the American people. But the Americans were learning. Increased coastal patrols and air reconnaissance had begun to close the window for surprise attacks. Coast Guard cutters swept the shipping lanes, while Army Air Force's observation flights scanned the horizon for periscope wakes. The Christmas Eve bombardment was reluctantly canceled, deemed too risky for the submarines that would have to surface and expose themselves. I-17 lingered off the coast, her crew tense and eager. Meanwhile, fear was consuming the American West Coast like a contagion. Rumors of enemy submarines lurking offshore and saboteurs embedded in local communities filled the newspapers. Every blackout drill carried whispers of impending attack. Children were kept home from school. Families stockpiled food and water. The psychological groundwork for mass hysteria was already in place. It just needed a spark. On February 13, 1942, the Pacific Coast Congressional Subcommittee on Aliens and Sabotage took their mounting fears directly to the White House. Their recommendation was sweeping. Evacuate every person of Japanese descent, citizens and non-citizens alike, from all strategic areas along the West Coast. No distinctions would be made between the loyal and the suspect. 3 days later, President Roosevelt handed the explosive issue to Secretary of War Henry Stimson. Behind closed doors in the Pentagon, Stimson convened urgent meetings with the senior staff. They reached the same conclusion. General John DeWitt, commanding the Western Defense Command, should be given full authority to begin mass evacuations wherever he judged them necessary. The machinery for mass removal was being assembled piece by piece. Detention camps surveyed, transportation coordinated, legal justifications prepared. All it needed was a dramatic incident to silence any remaining opposition and provide unshakable public support. That incident was already approaching the California coast, hidden beneath the Pacific's dark waters. The surfacing. At exactly 7 p.m. on February 23, 1942, the Japanese submarine I-17 surfaced off the coast of Ellwood, California. The sun had vanished behind the Pacific horizon, streaking the sky with bands of red and orange that seemed to prophesy the violence about to unfold. 12 miles west of Santa Barbara, the Ellwood and South Ellwood offshore oil fields stretch along the bluffs and just offshore of Goleta, facing the Santa Barbara Channel. In the 1930s, they were among the region's most productive petroleum sites, strategic assets perched on a vulnerable stretch of California's coastline. The crew of I-17 moved quickly and efficiently. The deck gun was uncovered, and shells were loaded into the breech. The gun crew took their positions, adjusting elevation and bearing as they aimed at the nearest target, a massive white Richfield aviation fuel tank sitting like a beacon just inland from the shoreline. On land, the Ellwood oil facility seemed peaceful in the gathering darkness. Most of the day shift workers had clocked out and driven home. A few remained on duty, none suspecting they were about to witness the first enemy bombardment of the American mainland since the War of 1812. Then, at 7:15 p.m., Nishino gave the order. The first shot cracked across the water like thunder, the muzzle flash illuminating the submarine's deck in stark white light. The shell screamed through the darkness and exploded near one of the storage tanks, sending a geyser of dirt and debris into the air. Workers at the facility thought it might be some kind of mechanical failure or a car backfiring on the coastal highway. Then the second shell struck, and the ground shook beneath their feet. One oiler working the night shift named Brown stepped outside his building and peered toward the horizon. In the dim light, he could make out a long, dark shape rising and falling with the ocean swells. Brown later told reporters that at first it looked massive, maybe a cruiser or a destroyer, until he noticed only one gun was firing. The reality of what was happening began to sink in with terrifying clarity. The enemy had come to California. Eyewitness accounts. Inside Wheeler's Inn, just off Highway 101 near the Ellwood Pier, the building's windows rattled with each successive impact. Lawrence Wheeler was behind the bar when the first shell screamed overhead, close enough that he could hear the projectile's deadly whistle. He bolted for the telephone, hands shaking as he dialed the operator. He reported to anyone who would listen that a shell had passed right over the building, adding, quote, "The others whined overhead and dropped into the canyon across the highway. Their marksmanship was rotten." But poor aim didn't make the shells any less terrifying as they continued to fall around the inn. His wife, Hilda Wheeler, had been in the back room when the bombardment began. She rushed to the windows and watched in horror. She later recalled, quote, "We saw the shells tearing up the ground as they landed between us and the ocean front. We couldn't see the submarine because the sunset was very brilliant. We all thought at first it was target practice. And then we looked out back and saw the earth spurting up, and we were scared to death. The third shot shook the building." In Winchester Canyon, 10-year-old J.J. Hollister was sitting with his family around the radio, listening to President Roosevelt's evening broadcast. The familiar voice was suddenly interrupted by a tremendous shock that rattled the house's windows and sent dishes clattering in the kitchen. Hollister remembered decades later, quote, "In a moment or two we heard a whistling noise and a thump as a projectile hit near the house. His family rushed outside to see bright flashes lighting up the shoreline like lightning, followed by the rumble of explosions. Hollister noted that some shots were followed by, quote, an eerie whistling and caterwauling. It was a sickening sound." Meanwhile, from his position on I-17's bridge, torpedo officer Nobukuyo Nambu observed the results through the coastal fog and gathering darkness. He could see chaos spreading across the target area. Lights were coming on in houses and buildings. People were running. Cars were pulling over on the highway as drivers tried to figure out what was happening. Nambu would report to Commander Nishino with evident satisfaction that the psychological impact was exceeding their wildest expectations. Minimal damage, maximum disruption. The bombardment scattered damage across a wider area than expected. I-17 shells fell across the Ellwood facility and the surrounding countryside. One projectile struck a wooden derrick, splintering it into matchsticks. Another smashed directly into a pump house, reducing it to rubble. The Ellwood pier caught a glancing blow that sent planks flying into the surf. More shells landed inland, striking a nearby ranch and igniting small fires in the dry brush of the coastal canyons. The massive fuel storage tanks, the primary targets that could have created a spectacular conflagration, remained stubbornly intact. Nishino shifted his aim to a second tank complex deeper inland. The gun crew adjusted their elevation and bearing, sending more shells arcing through the darkness. Still, the fuel reserves refused to ignite. The submarine was rocking in the ocean swells, and visibility was deteriorating as coastal fog rolled in from the Pacific. The gunners were essentially firing blind, relying on pre-plotted coordinates and guesswork. At the oil facility, the remaining workers scrambled to telephone the authorities. Brown and his colleagues tried repeatedly to reach the sheriff's department, but the phone lines were jammed with confused and panicked calls from across the region. At Wheeler's Inn, Lawrence finally got through to a deputy sheriff who assured him that warplanes were already on their way. But no planes came roaring to the rescue. A Coast Guard patrol boat that had been stationed offshore vanished days before, pulled without warning. The Marines with patrol bombers at nearby Galita Airport had also been reassigned. Even the Army's 2 howitzers, once aimed out to sea from Coal Oil Point, had been hauled away without explanation. The result, Ellwood's vital oil installations were left completely exposed. After Pearl Harbor, the military scrambled to plug holes along the entire Pacific coast. Defenses were shuffled constantly, some argue too recklessly. The pullouts at Ellwood might have been part of a larger strategy, repositioning forces where the threat seemed greater. Or maybe it was just poor timing. But when shells slammed into California soil, people wanted answers. Conspiracy theories surged, claims that the military had left Ellwood open on purpose to justify mass internment or to stir public outrage. Historians have dismissed most of it, but the fact remained. Despite signs, despite warnings, despite the sinking of the Amidio, Ellwood was vulnerable, and the enemy knew it. Panic spreads. The News Press newsroom in Santa Barbara erupted into mayhem as reports flooded in from across the region. The first call came from a man at the Trout Club in the San Marcos Pass, claiming he could see explosions and gunfire at the coast. The editor's first instinct was disbelief. He flatly told the caller, quote, "You're loco," and then hung up. Within minutes, the switchboard lit up like a Christmas tree. The reports were too numerous and consistent to be dismissed as hysteria or a hoax. Traffic on Highway 101 began to slow as evening commuters noticed the strange flashes on the horizon. Some drivers pulled over to get a better look, thinking they might be witnessing fireworks or some kind of celebration. Others weren't so sure. Word spread from car to car, and soon a small crowd had gathered near Wheeler's Inn, sharing rumors and theories while pointing toward the dark ocean, where muzzle flashes continued to illuminate the night. The bombardment lasted exactly 20 minutes. At 7:35 p.m., Commander Nishino gave the order to cease fire. I-17 turned away from the coast and slipped beneath the Pacific's surface, leaving behind a landscape transformed by terror and a nation that would never feel safe again. By 8 p.m., the entire West Coast, from Monterey to San Diego, had plunged into darkness as blackout orders went into effect. Civil defense authorities blocked all vehicle traffic on Highway 101 from Gaviota to Ventura. Radio stations went off the air, except for emergency broadcasts. Everyone braced for a fresh wave of attacks that never came. In downtown Santa Barbara, air raid wardens took their positions, while searchlights swept the sky looking for enemy aircraft. The sheriff's department was flooded with calls reporting suspicious lights in the hills, signals supposedly being flashed to guide more submarines to targets along the coast. Just 2 days later, that fear reached a boiling point. On the night of February 24th, 1942, the sky over Los Angeles erupted. Sirens wailed. Searchlights crisscrossed the darkness. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. 1,400 shells hurled at phantom planes. The bedlam left buildings damaged, and 5 civilians lost their lives in car accidents and heart attacks triggered by the panic. No enemy aircraft were ever confirmed. The Battle of Los Angeles, or the Great Los Angeles Air Raid, as it came to be called, had begun in the shadows cast by Ellwood. Propaganda and revenge. 2 days after the raid on Ellwood, Radio Tokyo triumphantly declared that, quote, Santa Barbara, California was devastated by enemy bombardment. Japanese naval records claimed they had, quote, left Santa Barbara in flames. The truth was far less dramatic. The damage amounted to a pierced pier, a broken derrick, and a scorched pump house. There were no mass casualties, and repair crews had already begun patching things up before sunrise. To the Japanese public, this was a bold blow to the enemy's mainland. It was the first Axis attack on continental U.S. soil in the war, regardless of its scale, and Japan spun it into a morale-boosting victory. While the shelling had no real tactical effect, it achieved one major strategic goal: psychological disruption. Americans now knew they could be hit at home. Other Japanese submarines followed up with similar nuisance attacks. Fort Stevens on the Columbia River was shelled in June 1942. A Canadian lighthouse on Vancouver Island was fired on. Then came the surreal firebombing attempts. Japanese subs launched tiny planes loaded with incendiaries to ignite Oregon's forests. None caused major damage, but each reminded the U.S. that the war wasn't as distant as many had believed. Americans responded with outrage and action. Avenge Ellwood became a rallying cry. The American Women's Voluntary Services launched a war bond drive under the slogan, raising money to fund 2 warplanes, a bomber dubbed the Flying Santa Barbaran, and a fighter named the Ellwood Avenger. Neither saw combat, but the symbolism stuck. Meanwhile, the story of Captain Nishino's supposed vendetta over falling into a cactus at Ellwood years before, becoming the motive for the bombardment, spread like wildfire. But it was fiction. Nishino had no connection to the oil fields. Naval records confirm he had served steadily in submarines since the 1920s. Ellwood was selected for a different reason. On February 22, 1942, Nishino received orders to strike a West Coast target at sunset the next day. Lieutenant Atsuo Yamazaki proposed Ellwood, lightly defended, easy to approach, and even easier to slip away from. Nishino approved the plan. There was no cactus, no vendetta, only strategy and fear. Final fate. After bombarding Ellwood in February 1942, I-17 lingered off the California coast, shadowing tankers and searching for new targets. Over the following year, it shifted to the Pacific Theater, running supply missions to Guadalcanal and rescuing survivors after the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. In May 1943, it torpedoed the tanker Stenbach Manila, sending 2 U.S. PT boats to the bottom. But in August, its luck ran out. South of New Caledonia, I-17's float plane spotted an Allied convoy. As the sub moved to intercept, the New Zealand ship Tui picked up its signal. Depth charges rained down, forcing I-17 to surface, leaking oil. Briefly, it vanished, then broke the surface again, its bow rising steeply. A U.S. Kingfisher strafed the deck and dropped more charges. I-17 sank for good, and 91 sailors were lost. Only 6 were pulled from the sea. Overshadowed by the attack on Pearl Harbor, the 1942 shelling of Ellwood, California, remains a lesser-known moment of World War II, but one with an outsized psychological impact, as it also helped justify a Japanese-American internment. Decades later, Steven Spielberg turned the episode into dark farce with his 1979 film 1941, a ribald comedy about stateside war hysteria. Though played for laughs on screen, the real events at Ellwood revealed just how deeply fear had taken root on the American home front.